This episode of Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Inside the Breakthrough, a new history of science podcast full of did you know stuff.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Welcome to a classic episode of the show. As always, so glad to have you along. I'm your host, Stacey Sims, and we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. You know, on this show, we talk to people living with type 1, kind of what I call everyday people, as well as people who are really pushing the limits. And while most of us will never run multiple marathons or compete under extreme conditions like in the Arctic, it is so wonderful to know that if you really want to go to the extremes, you can do that with diabetes. It's one of the fun things about bringing back these older episodes, and that's what I'm doing here with these classic episodes, kind of a bonus every week in 2021, bringing back episodes where I talk to terrific people with great stories in the first couple of years of the show. Not everybody listened in 2015 and 2016, and we have more than 360 episodes now. So these classic episodes have been really popular, and I'm thrilled that I've heard from many of you who are enjoying them. So that is fantastic. And I did speak to Sebastien Sasseville for one of my very first episodes back in the summer of 2015. Sebastien made it to the summit of Mt Everest in 2008, and he wore an insulin pump, and he talks about that. He then completed 6 Ironman races. And the Ironman, it's a triathlon. And I always have to break it down because it always sounds ridiculous. It's a 2.4-mile swim, a 112-mile bike ride, and then a marathon, 26.2 miles thrown on the end there. And Sebastien went on to complete the brutal Sahara race. You will hear more about what that entails. And then in 2014, he ran across Canada to raise awareness for diabetes, and that was the equivalent of 170 marathons in 9 months. These days, Sebastien Sasseville is a motivational speaker. He's an author. Late last year, he teamed up with Tandem Diabetes as a brand ambassador. I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more from him in that role. But I am fascinated by extreme athletes. I'm so different from that. I love to know what makes them tick. And I was amazed, and you'll hear Sebastien talk about when he says he was never really good at sports growing up. I mean, I'll let him tell his own story, but it was really interesting to listen back to that interview. Okay, this episode of Diabetes Connections is supported by Inside the Breakthrough, surprising stories from the history of science. Dan Riskin digs deep and entertains as he connects these old stories to what modern-day medical researchers are facing. The latest episode looks at a scientific theory all around unleaded gasoline and the crime rate. It turns out better policing may not be a match for better gas. It's a wild one. You can find Inside the Breakthrough anywhere you listen to podcasts. Anywhere you found this podcast, you can find them. And this podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Just before I play this interview with Sebastien Sasseville, I need to let you know about a little bit of sound quality issue here. This was conducted at the Friends for Life conference. As I mentioned, this was back in 2015. I was kind of just learning the technical side of podcasting. And there is some background noise. You're going to hear kids playing in the next room. I think some of them passed by in the hallway at some point. Shouldn't be too distracting, but it is there. And I just wanted to give you a heads up. Sebastien, thank you so much for joining me. There's so much to talk about.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Well, I first heard your name, I think like so many people did, last summer when you had this incredible accomplishment, or really last year, it wasn't just the summer, of running across Canada. There's many other things to talk about, but let's start there. Why did that come to mind as something that was a good idea to do?
It didn't feel like a good idea when I was on the starting line. So the goal was to inspire, educate, and empower. The Run Across Canada was not a fundraiser, and that's the interesting thing about it. All I wanted to do was to change how people felt about their disease. I wanted people to feel differently about what they felt they could do and couldn't do with diabetes. And obviously, I think the sky's the limit. I don't think there's any limitation that come with the disease. But I wanted to do something bold, something big that would help people feel like that.
Well, it's an amazing accomplishment. And I remember You started in February?
February 2nd.
I remember every couple of days or even weeks, I would think, he's still running. Like, that guy is still there. He's still running. And you completed it on World Diabetes Day in November.
Yeah, it took 9.5 months. So almost a full year running 5 or 6 marathons a week.
It's inconceivable, I think, to most of us. Let me back up then. Tell us a little bit more about your story. When were you diagnosed with diabetes?
So I was 22 when I was diagnosed with diabetes, so reasonably late onset. I was in college. I was getting done with college, and I was not a very active kid. So with the disease came a choice, and I needed to choose what kind of lifestyle I wanted to lead, and I started to exercise a little more. And the whole thing was very progressive. Like, I didn't start with climbing Mt Everest. I just started with... started to climb a little bit, started to run a little bit, and I wasn't very good in sports. And I think that's one of the most important part of my story. That's the first thing I want people to know, that back in the days when I was in high school, I was that kid who was picked last in the team all the time. I was not, and I still am not, a very gifted athlete. I just work really, really, really hard to do the things that I like to do. So, diagnosed, started to be a little more active, and then the projects grew bigger. And I think that the thrill really comes from helping people. The thrill comes from trying to make a difference, and that's always been my paycheck. When we are getting letters and emails and phone calls from parents with kids living with diabetes, and would tell me things like, hey, we followed the run, we followed the climb, and that really gave us hope. Nothing can make me feel any better than that. So that's why I do it. Okay,
so again, though, backing up to when you were diagnosed, and you weren't athletic, it really is amazing to think about that with everything you've accomplished since. Can you take us back to that time in terms of how you thought your life might change? Were you scared? Were you worried? Was it a challenge at the time?
It was. I was scared and I was worried. My brother also lives with type 1 diabetes. I'm the oldest, so he was diagnosed before I was. And so obviously when he was diagnosed, it was a big shock to the family, and then he started to live with diabetes. We, as a family, learned more about it. And but still, when I was diagnosed, I had my own dreams, my own life, and things that I wanted to do, and that was the hardest thing. Like, at the time, my biggest dream was to travel. I wanted to backpack around the world. I was a college student, and like many college students, that's what I wanted to do. And my biggest fear was, am I going to be able to do that? Mm. And I think we all go through those moments of doubts and fear, regardless of what is that thing that is most important to us. We all share that moment when we're diagnosed, when we don't know. And I guess part of my message is that we do have that moment in common, but what happens next is totally up to us. And each of us will have and should have a great individual story that we get to pick. And diabetes should never be a break to that.
So as a parent of a child with type 1 who gets concerned about packing for vacation to Florida, what is your advice since you have packed and gone to Mt Everest? I mean, I'm kidding, but what did you bring? How did you prepare for something like that? This was in 2008.
2008. And it took years to prepare. So picture a trip where you would spend years packing, years taking notes, years trying to figure out with a medical team, with your teammates, what you should bring or what you shouldn't bring. So that too, getting to a point where I was comfortable with my diabetes strategy, going on Mt Everest or running across the Sahara or running Ironmans, that too was progressive. So I, like everybody, just started with a weekender with the camping trips and made mistakes and forgot stuff. And I think it's really important with diabetes to get rid of that concept of failure and just leverage and utilize and cherish every opportunity. I think it's important to educate ourselves, to prepare well, and then to experiment. And if you go to that next logical step, even if it doesn't go according to plan, you will learn something. Even if you quote-unquote fail, it will be a positive experience. If you've been sincere and honest with yourself, if you went to that next logical step, good things happen. So that applied to Mount Everest, and I spent years traveling and climbing and taking notes, and one day I felt comfortable about what I had learned and felt very comfortable actually going to Mount Everest. I remember looking at all my diabetes stuff and supplies and the strategy and my notes, and I remember showing up at base camp feeling actually pretty confident, but that took years.
Were there any hiccups diabetes-wise along the way? I mean, I'm sure Mount Everest has other challenges, but did anything go wrong? Nothing
went wrong diabetes-wise. I did freeze some insulin in another trip a few years prior, which was a great learning experience, because you have to learn about how to manage your diabetes, but you also have to learn how to manage a diabetes strategy, contingencies, where you're going to store supplies, how you're going to transport supplies. And that's very key when you're in those environments.
Take us to the moment when you finished the climb at Mount Everest. What was that like?
That moment would be when you get back to base camp, several days after you reach the summit. And we tend to forget about that sometimes. The summit is the half mark. Most people that die on Mount Everest have reached the summit. They die on the way down.
Oh, my goodness.
So the summit was incredibly joyful and powerful, but it doesn't last for very long. So you spend all of those years, sometimes a lifetime, prepping for that moment. And if you're lucky enough to make it to the top, you're there for 5 minutes at the most. So to me, it's a lot more about what it represents. And I was in such bad shape. I mean, you suffer up there, and altitude is hard. And so I do remember the summit. It was very joyful. It was powerful, but it's a big blur, right? So I think the lesson that came out of that for me, both my personal, my professional life, and diabetes, of course, is that success is just a point in time. It doesn't last for very long. Success should never be the goal. It should be a consequence to all the good things that we do. So instead of focusing on just the numbers, focusing on diabetes only, focusing on being obsessed with that perfect A1C, I think if we forget about that a little bit and just focus on I call them growth habits. So I don't think about the numbers. I just focus on creating growth habits, creating things that are helping me learn about diabetes and things that are helping me make tomorrow better. And if I do that, then tomorrow comes a little faster, a little easier, and interestingly enough, I'll be a little more successful. I'll reach more summits, so it's definitely a win-win.
A few minutes ago, you mentioned the Ironman races. I think you've done 6, is that correct? Mm-hmm. And the Sahara race in Egypt, which just seems crazy. What is that race?
250 kilometers across the Sahara Desert in 5 days, self-supported.
Right,
and for a person with type 1 diabetes, the self-supported part is absolutely exciting and challenging and scary and all of the above. Because you show up, let's say on Monday morning at the start of the race, you have in your backpack, which you also need to carry, all your gear and all your food. And you've got a very limited amount of food and carbs. And that's what you have for the week. And trust me, no one's going to share food with you
they don't care.
During that week because you have so little. I lost about 14 pounds in 5 days.
Wow.
So you have a budget for how many low blood sugars you can afford. And you're going to run anywhere from 5 to 6 hours per day the first 4 days, and then the last day is a double stage, 87 kilometers, about 60 miles, and you run in sand, temperatures, in the 100s, and you got to manage diabetes, and that last day, that final stage, takes about anywhere from 11 hours to 24 hours for some people.
Boy, we could talk about that for another half an hour. I do want to talk about the journey across Canada. But first, I have to ask you, again, as a parent, you have a brother who has type 1, your younger brother.
Yeah.
Do your parents sign off on all this? You're a grown-up. You were a grown-up when you were diagnosed. They must worry about you. I mean, I wouldn't want my son to not do things he wants to do, and I wouldn't want to hold him back, but I'd be lying if I would say I wouldn't worry.
Yeah, they worry. They're parents, and it would worry me if they didn't worry. So we were both, my brother was 16 when he was diagnosed, so not quite an adult yet, but we were both out of the house, pretty young. So when I was diagnosed at the age of 22, I was living on my own, so they never had to manage our diabetes. So that's, I guess, a plus. That's something they didn't have to go through. I've always thought that diabetes affects, obviously, the whole family cell. Diabetes and any obstacles, for that matter, what I've found, because I go to a lot of diabetes camps, I speak to a ton of patients, to a ton of parents, and I've always found that it acts a little bit like a magnifying glasses. So it will make what was already there in terms of psychological traits or habits, it will make what was already there a lot bigger, a lot more visible. So the mom that, for example, cannot learn to let go, then that becomes a lot more visible with diabetes. But guess what? Even without diabetes, it would have been tough to let go when her son or daughter goes off to college, and that would have been a very difficult experience regardless of diabetes. So the obstacle will make that kind of stuff bigger. It will make the good and the bad bigger. So again, it becomes an opportunity, and it goes back to that concept of choice. Like, am I going to try to welcome that and view it as a gift, view it as an opportunity, which doesn't mean it's always going to be easy. And as a matter of fact, it's probably going to make things a lot harder, but it's going to help everybody grow. And I think it's helped my parents grow and learn a few things as well. And at the end of the day, we're all thankful for diabetes.
Wow. The run across Canada. Take us through a day of that, if you could. I'm sure every day was different, but especially towards the latter parts. How did you get through what must have been so physically punishing? I mean, day in, day out, to keep moving. How'd you do it?
So, sometimes I don't know. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. It just happened. I focused on one step at a time, running a little bit every day. If you can call almost a marathon a little bit. The routine was fairly simple. We got up, I did breakfast, then I was being dropped off at the starting point. I ran 20 kilometers. So about a half a marathon, a little short of half a marathon every morning. Then took a pause for lunch, carved up, looked after diabetes, and then a second 20-kilometer segment in the afternoon, and then went back to hotel or campground, wherever we were staying. And then the second shift started, which was the most challenging part of the day. I did about 125 interviews last year, 41 events. We had a film crew, we had a PR firm to deal with, we had our partners, conference calls and emails and all of that. So the run was actually very... I'm never ever going to say it was the easy part, but the second shift was the real marathon. So the whole year was definitely exhausting, and how we got through tough days. And I always say we because I ran the whole thing, but I always say we because for one guy who runs across Canada, you need a team, you need support, and I'll be forever thankful to the people that helped make it happen. But we just always made sure to stay connected with the reason why. When I started to work on the project, one of the first things that I would say was that, like, I want the guy running to be the least important part of the project. What matters is not what I do. What's really important is what it means. So how are we going to make this run meaningful and useful and beneficial for everybody who lives with diabetes in Canada and potentially around the world? So I wanted everybody to own the run. I wanted everybody to be able to be a part of it, to run a little bit, or at least to be affected by it in some way. And that was the goal number one. That was much more important than running across the country.
Are you going to do it again? Any other plans, or what's next?
I flew back. I flew back home from Vancouver. I didn't. I don't think I'll do it again. I would love, of course, and I know I will be involved in a project like that again. It will be, a different form, a different challenge, but the goal will be the same.
That's great. And we're here at Friends for Life. You're meeting a lot of kids, telling your story, and really inspiring people. What's it like for you to see these kids? They're diagnosed, many of them much younger than you. What do you tell them? What's the interaction like?
It's always a little different, but it always boils down to that same message. If they go home this weekend with the feeling that they can chase their dreams and accomplish pretty much anything they set their mind to and pursue their dreams, that's the core of the conversation. And they're brilliant. They have a lot of things they want to do. So it's inspiring for me as well to see, so many great kids with such positive attitude. I find them very courageous and strong. I don't know if I could have done it myself at that age. So I get a lot of it. I get a lot out of it as well, definitely.
Just curious, you have your Animus pump. You wear it outside. Everybody can see it. It's just kind of any hacks, suggestions, tricks, or tips that you can tell us? Because, you're a desert, Everest, running every day. And I'm thinking to myself, like, well, he must know stuff. Is there anything that you could share maybe about using a pump?
I like the question. I don't have, like, a special secret, something that I do that nobody knows about that makes... I have high blood sugars, I have low blood sugars. People should know that. I have good days and bad days with diabetes. I think what we have today to manage diabetes is absolutely wonderful. It's important to make it a priority. I've spent a lot of time taking notes and writing down stuff and making experiments, and that definitely has helped me. But on day one, I didn't know anything about pumps. I didn't know anything about diabetes, and I don't think diabetes is that complicated. I just think what's really hard is that there's so many things and it changes every day. And in regards to diabetes and exercise, the one thing that I would say though is that instead of trying to look for what works, view it as an equation. So it's not a recipe, it's an equation. And the minute people stop looking for what's always going to work and try to find that special recipe, the better off they'll be. So my job as a person with diabetes is to understand and learn as much as I can on each and every factors that impact my blood sugar when I exercise. And some impact my blood sugar directly. Some factors will impact my strategy, the things that I bring, and the things that I don't bring. For example, if I'm running a 5K loop that I'm very used to around my house, or if I'm running a 20K loop for the first time in the middle of nowhere, that's going to have a big impact on what I bring with me. So really look at it as a formula, be willing and flexible and humble, so that you can adapt and so that you understand that what's going to work is going to be different every single day. And if you approach it like that, then again, you stop focusing so much on the summit, on success, but you focus on growth habits, you focus on learning, and that leads to pretty good results.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. It's fabulous to meet you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
I will link up more information on Sebastien Sasseville at diabetes-connections.com on the episode homepage. Every episode, more recently, has a transcript, so you can go and read that if you prefer, or send that to a friend. I really enjoyed listening back, although I got to tell you, with these classic episodes, it's so funny for me just as a broadcaster to listen to myself in the early days of this podcast and remember how different it was. I think I did that episode on a laptop or an iPad. I think I did it on an iPad with a microphone that I don't use anymore. I was doing voice work back in 2013 and 2014 when I started the podcast, and I used to do it all on my iPad. And I really should bring out that mic and see, does it even still work? It was an Apogee microphone. If you're a microphone person or a broadcast person, it's a great microphone, but I think I only could use it in the old iPad. It has one of those wide connectors. Anyway, as I was listening, that was what I picked up. I don't know, a little bit of inside baseball there, but as always, more information on the actual guest and subject at diabetes-connections.com. Thank you, as always, for listening. Thank you to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here in just a couple of days. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.